Maya Carter stepped into the courtroom with a calm that belied the knot in her stomach. The small-town courthouse felt familiar, but today everything felt different. She'd been through this before: the routine of a traffic stop, a misunderstanding with the officer, the tickets she'd had to fight. But today she couldn't shake the feeling that this time it wouldn't go in her favor. Maya had always prided herself on staying composed no matter the situation. She wasn't one to make a scene. She knew how to navigate the world and the system. But there was something about this judge, something in the way his eyes scanned the room as he listened to the proceedings, that made her uneasy. His gaze seemed calculating, his features sharp, like he was mentally dissecting every word spoken. She knew judges like him, the kind who followed the letter of the law, with little room for mercy. Thomas Montgomery was one of the most respected judges in the county, and the fact that she was standing before him made her feel exposed, as though every part of her life was being evaluated, as if she were a specimen in a lab to be measured and analyzed. She could feel his eyes on her now, those cold gray eyes, as they followed her every move, the shuffle of papers, the way she adjusted her coat, the way she breathed. Maya could almost hear his thoughts as he looked at her. She could see the way his mind was working, calculating the sentence, already passing judgment before she even opened her mouth. It wasn't personal, just procedural, but it felt personal to her. It always felt personal to her when she was a black woman standing in front of white authority figures, even for something as small as a traffic ticket. She cleared her throat and began to speak, explaining the circumstances surrounding her infraction. The officer had stopped her because she was allegedly speeding, but she knew she hadn't been. She had simply been caught up in the rush of a long day, and the heavy traffic had caused her to misjudge the timing of the lights. Maya spoke steadily, her voice firm but calm, hoping he would understand. She had been careful. There had been no intent to break the law. But as she spoke, she noticed something strange in the judge's eyes. He wasn't looking at her like someone who was trying to get the facts straight. He was looking at her like he was sizing her up, assessing her worthiness, as though the fine wasn't about the law, but about something deeper, about who she was, what she represented, and how he saw her as a black woman in his courtroom. Maya felt a wave of frustration building, but she kept her face neutral even as her heart began to race. She wasn't here to fight for fairness. She was here to defend herself against the inevitable outcome that was coming. She had been in enough courtrooms to know how it went, no matter how eloquent or calm she was. The decision had already been made from the moment she stepped in front of him. The moment she walked into his world, she was already guilty. The judge didn't look at her. He looked at the clock, then back at the paperwork in front of him, and without another word, he made his decision. It was final, a fine, a stiff fine, one that would take a good chunk of her paycheck to cover. No warnings, no leniency, just the cold, hard reality of the law as he saw it. And with that, the hammer fell, and Maya left the courtroom feeling smaller than she had when she entered. Maya left the courthouse with a heavy heart, the fine burning in her pocket as much as the sting in her chest. It wasn't just the money. It was the feeling of being powerless, of having no say in her own fate. As she walked to her car, the weight of it all pressed down on her. The courtroom, the judge, the system. She couldn't help but think back to the judge's cold expression, the way he had barely acknowledged her as a person. Just another case to be processed. It didn't matter that she had been careful or that she tried to explain herself. She was just another black woman in a system designed to keep her down. But this wasn't all there was to her. Maya wasn't just a victim of the system. She was a writer, an activist, a voice who had learned to fight in different ways. The courtroom was just one part of her life. She wasn't about to let a judge's indifferent ruling define her. As the weight of the fine settled into her mind, Maya's thoughts turned to something else. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, seeing a message from Thomas Montgomery. She had almost forgotten that he was also her co-author on a book they had been working on for months. It was a book about the justice system, about race, about the things that people like her, people who looked like her, had to endure every day in courtrooms just like the one she had just left. Thomas Montgomery, the very man who had just found her, was also the man who had been helping her write a book. Their partnership had started as something unexpected. She, an up-and-coming writer with a growing platform for activism, had crossed paths with him at a charity event. He, A well-known white judge with a reputation for being tough but fair had been intrigued by her perspectives on the law. It was a casual conversation that turned into long discussions, then into the idea of a book. A book that could finally pull back the curtain on what Maya had always known. The justice system wasn't just broken, it was biased. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same man who had ruled so harshly in her case was the one who was sitting with her, page after page, chapter after chapter, to help bring the stories of people like her to light. He wasn't just a judge. He had become her partner, someone she trusted with her voice. Maya stared at the phone screen, her fingers hesitating before she responded. Should I mention what happened in court? The thought gnawed at her. On one hand, she didn't want to make it personal, but on the other, it felt like there was no other way forward. Her fingers tapped out a quick response. Hey Thomas, I just left the courthouse. I got fined for that ticket. I can't help but feel like it's all part of the system we've been writing about. She paused, chewing on her bottom lip, then hit send. It didn't take long for him to reply. His message was short, almost too quick. I'm sorry, Maya. Let's talk later. I'll call you. The weight of those words hit her harder than the fine itself. He knew how she felt. The reality of their situation settled in. How could they possibly keep working together when he had just been the face of the very system they were trying to change? She knew that writing about systemic injustice and confronting it head-on were two different things. Would he even be able to face her after this? Or had their partnership already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? The silence on the other end of the phone felt deafening. And yet, in the quiet, Maya realized something important. She wasn't walking this road alone. She had work to do, a message to deliver, and a man, no matter how complicated their dynamic, who had become a partner in the fight. She couldn't back down now. The next morning, Maya sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone in her hands. She had barely slept the night before, the conversation with Thomas playing over and over in her mind. How could he be so blind? She kept asking herself. The judge who had just fined her, who had treated her with such indifference in court, was the same man who had spent hours with her crafting a book about racial justice. The disparity between his professional persona and his personal connection to her left her unsettled. She wanted to lash out, to confront him. But at the same time, she didn't know if she was ready for that conversation. She had always kept a clear boundary between her activism and her personal life, but now it felt like those boundaries were crumbling. Thomas's call came just as she finished her coffee, his voice on the other end of the line carrying an unfamiliar weight. Maya, he said, the tone of his voice making her stomach tighten. I've been thinking about what you said last night. About the fine. About everything. I never meant to hurt you, but I get why it feels that way. Maya took a slow breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. You don't understand, Thomas, she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. It wasn't just the fine. It was the way you looked at me in that courtroom, like I was just another case file to be processed. I felt invisible, like you didn't even see me as a person. There was a long silence on the other end. She could hear him shifting in his seat. I never meant to make you feel that way, he said finally, the words heavy with guilt. I've been thinking about it, and you're right. I've treated people in the courtroom as cases, not as human beings. But it's different with you. It has to be. Maya's chest tightened, and she leaned back in her chair. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man she had worked with for months, who had shared in her pain and frustration, wasn't just another cog in a machine that perpetuated injustice. But could she? You don't get to turn that off, Thomas, she said. Being a judge isn't just a job. It's a responsibility. And when you handed down that fine, it wasn't just about the law. It was about who I am and how you see me. I'm not just some black woman to be processed through your system. I'm a person. Thomas's voice softened. I know, Maya. I know. I don't have all the answers, but I want to try. I need to understand, truly understand, how my position has affected people like you. How my decisions, how the system, affects people like you. Maya was quiet for a moment, letting his words sink in. For the first time since the court case, she didn't feel just angry. She felt something else, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this man could change. Maybe he wasn't just a judge behind the bench, issuing sentences and decisions. Maybe he was capable of seeing her. "You can't change overnight, Thomas," she said slowly, her voice steady, but still carrying the weight of their past conversation. "But you can start by acknowledging that there's a problem. And that means looking at people, really looking at them, before you make your decisions." "I want to," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes. I don't want to be the man who finds people like you. I want to be part of the solution." Maya could feel the sincerity in his words, but she knew actions spoke louder than words. Change was never easy, especially when it meant confronting long-held biases. She wasn't sure what this meant for their partnership or even for their book, but in that moment, she realized they were standing at a crossroads together. The question was, could they both walk the same path? "I'll hold you to that," she said softly, "but it has to be real. And it has to come from within." Thomas didn't answer right away, but in his silence, Maya heard what she needed to hear. He wasn't backing away from the challenge, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that he might just be capable of seeing the world through her eyes. That small spark of hope was enough to keep her going for now. The next few days were a blur of editing, writing, and silent contemplation. Maya and Thomas had agreed to meet again to discuss their book, but the tension between them was undeniable. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope. Maya was still processing the court case and her feelings toward Thomas. On one hand, he had acknowledged his mistakes, even promised to change, but could she really trust him? Could she trust him, the judge who had treated her like a statistic, who had imposed a fine that felt like a reminder of everything that was wrong with the justice system? It was late afternoon when Thomas called her, asking if she could meet him at their usual cafe. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Maya," he said, his voice low and almost apologetic. "About everything. About the book. About us." Maya hesitated before agreeing. Her emotions were still raw, but she knew they had unfinished business. She grabbed her jacket, grabbed her notebook, and headed out the door. When she arrived at the cafe, Thomas was already there, sitting in their usual corner. He looked up as she walked in, his expression unreadable. But there was something different about the way he held himself today. He wasn't just the judge anymore. He seemed more human, more vulnerable. Maybe it was the guilt he couldn't shake, or the weight of their conversation still sitting heavy on his chest. Maya took a seat across from him, her gaze fixed on the table between them. She didn't say anything at first, not wanting to break the silence. Thomas was the first to speak. "I've been reflecting on what you said, Maya," he began, his voice careful, measured. "About the fine. About how I've treated people. It's not just the black community, is it? It's everyone who doesn't fit the mold of the ideal citizen in the eyes of the law. I've spent my entire career judging people, but I've never really seen them. And that's my failing." Maya looked up at him, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "It's more than just your failing, Thomas," she said quietly. "It's the system. The whole system is built on these assumptions, these biases. You may not have created it, but you've perpetuated it, just like everyone else who sits on the other side of the bench." Thomas nodded, his face tightening with the weight of her words. "I never wanted to be a part of that. But I realize now that I am. And I'm not sure where to start. I don't know how to fix it. But I want to try. I have to try." Maya leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She didn't want to make it easy for him. She couldn't afford to. There were too many people, too many families, who had suffered under the weight of a system that wasn't built for them. Maya wasn't here to forgive. She was here to hold him accountable. "You're right about the system," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But that's the thing, Thomas. It's not enough to just want to fix it. You have to actively fight it. You can't just sit on the bench and hope that things change. You need to get involved, get your hands dirty. Real change is uncomfortable. Thomas absorbed her words, his gaze intense as he listened. He nodded, his jaw tight. I get it. I do. And I'll try. But I need your help, Maya. I can't do this alone. I don't even know what the next step is, but I want to find it. I want to be part of the solution. Maya looked at him for a long moment. His sincerity was obvious, but so was his lack of understanding. She could see the desire for change in his eyes, but she wasn't sure he yet understood the magnitude of what he was asking. Change wasn't just about apologizing or promising to do better. It was about action. It was about accountability. You're asking the right questions, she said slowly. But you're right, you can't do this alone. No one can, but don't ask me to lead you to the answer. You need to start looking for it yourself. I'll be here to support you, but you need to take ownership. We both do. Thomas took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as he acknowledged the weight of her words. This wasn't going to be easy, for either of them. But if they were going to make a difference, it had to be together. I'll start, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. But we both know the hard part is yet to come. Maya nodded, feeling a faint flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that they might just be on the right path. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for. The days following their meeting were a strange mix of urgency and uncertainty. Maya had always been one to act quickly, to use her words and her platform to create change. But this partnership with Thomas was different. The complexity of their relationship, the history between them, and the monumental task ahead of them weighed heavily on her. Could someone like Thomas really change? Could he become a true ally in the fight for racial justice, or was he simply another well-meaning person who would falter when faced with the real challenges? Meanwhile, Thomas was immersed in the discomfort of his own thoughts, trying to figure out how to translate his newfound understanding into action. The apology had been easy. The promise to do better had come naturally. But now, the reality of what that would mean hit him with full force. He wasn't sure where to begin. The justice system was vast, and as much as he hated to admit it, his position in it made him part of the very structure that perpetuated inequality. He knew the work they were doing on their book was important, but it wasn't enough. He had to do more. Maya could feel the shift in him, though it wasn't always easy to pinpoint. She didn't trust him completely, not yet, but the subtle signs of change were there. She could tell that he was beginning to question everything, to look at his rulings with new eyes. And while that was promising, Maya knew the road ahead would be slow and painful. She had been doing this work for years. For him, this was a beginning. She couldn't afford to let him off easy. One afternoon, about a week after their conversation in the cafe, Thomas called her again, his voice different this time. More serious, almost anxious. Maya, I've been doing some thinking. I want to make it right. But I need your help, he said, without the usual warmth she'd come to expect from him. This was business now, serious business. Maya's gut instinct told her this wasn't just another apology. He had a plan, or at least an idea of one. Go on, she said, crossing her arms as she sat down at her desk, ready to listen. I've been talking to some of my colleagues in the judicial system, he continued. And I'm not going to lie, it's been difficult. Not everyone agrees with me, especially when I started talking about reforming how we approach sentencing and race in the courtroom. But there's an opportunity, a big one. There's a mentorship program for young black men in the local prison system that could use funding and legal support. They need someone who understands the system from the inside to get it off the ground. Maya felt a surge of interest, but also hesitation. This was the kind of initiative that could make a real impact, if done right. But there was always a catch. Could Thomas, with all his privilege, really navigate the complexities of a program like this? And what did legal support mean, exactly? She didn't want his involvement to be a superficial gesture, a way for him to ease his guilt. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Maya asked, her voice careful but firm. "This isn't about signing papers and writing a check. These young men don't need your charity. They need someone who will fight for them, who will advocate for real change, not just a pat on the back." "I know," Thomas said, his tone more determined now. "That's exactly why I'm asking you to be involved. You know this world. You know how these systems work better than I do. I'll do the legal work, but you'll be the one to ensure this program is rooted in real change. You'll make sure it's about them, not us." Maya was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was saying. She didn't know if she could trust him yet, but the idea of real impact was too important to ignore. This was the chance to do something tangible, something that could help break the cycle of incarceration and systemic racism. If she walked away from this opportunity, would she be turning her back on the very people she was fighting for? "All right," she said at last, her voice steady, but with a new sense of resolve. "I'll help, but we're doing this my way. You're not leading this, you're supporting it. I'll hold you accountable, Thomas, but if you're serious about this, then let's get to work." There was a brief silence before Thomas spoke again. "I won't let you down. I promise." For the first time, Maya believed him. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Maya had agreed to help Thomas launch the mentorship program, but she wasn't about to make it easy for him. Every step of the process, every decision, was scrutinized, tested, and shaped by her vision of what real change looked like. This couldn't be another empty initiative. She was determined to ensure that it didn't become a token gesture, a way for Thomas to cleanse his conscience without making any real sacrifices. Thomas, for his part, was learning fast. He threw himself into the work with a focus and drive that surprised Maya. He attended meetings with community leaders, listened to the stories of families affected by the prison system, and worked tirelessly on the legal side of things. But he wasn't leading this initiative, not in the way he would have led a courtroom. Maya had made it clear from the beginning that she wasn't interested in him being a figurehead. This was about the people, and she was the one who would ensure their needs were the priority. One afternoon, they met at a community center to speak with some of the young men who had recently been released from prison. The program they were setting up would offer mentorship, educational opportunities, and job placement, tools to help these men re-enter society and break the cycle of recidivism. Maya had arranged for a few of the participants to share their stories, and she watched as Thomas listened intently, his face a mask of concentration. But as one young man spoke about the trauma he had experienced in the system, Maya noticed Thomas shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The man's story wasn't just about incarceration. It was about survival, about growing up in a world that never gave him a chance. Thomas had never heard this before. He had spent his career making decisions that shaped lives, but had he ever truly understood the human cost of his rulings? Maya could see the realization dawning on his face. The guilt, the recognition that his decisions had been part of the problem. She watched him, her own expression unreadable. She had warned him that it wouldn't be easy, that confronting the truth could be painful. The meeting wrapped up after a few hours, but Maya lingered, waiting for Thomas to catch up. When he finally approached, his face was pale, his jaw tight. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. He nodded but didn't speak immediately. Finally, he said, his voice low, "I wasn't prepared for that. I thought I understood what these men went through, but I didn't know how deep it went. I didn't realize how much of their lives had been shaped by a system I've been a part of for so long." "Maya, She cut him off, her voice firm but calm. "You can't fix this with guilt, Thomas. You can't apologize your way out of this. You have to change what you do. You can't just sympathize with these men. You have to fight for them. You have to fight to change the system that put them in prison in the first place." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something close to understanding in them. It wasn't just guilt or shame, it was commitment. "I want to fight for them," he said quietly. I want to fight for justice, for real justice. Not the kind that's built on rules and procedures, but the kind that makes people's lives better. I've spent too much of my life making decisions from behind a desk, Maya. I want to be part of something that makes a difference. Maya didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, watching him carefully. She wasn't sure if she believed him yet, but there was a part of her that wanted to. There was something about the way he said it, the way he looked at her, that told her he wasn't just saying words. He meant it. "This isn't going to be easy," she finally said, her voice steady. "And it's not going to be fast. But if you're serious about this, if you're ready to fight alongside us, then we've got work to do. Real work." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." For the first time in their partnership, Maya felt something like trust. She wasn't ready to fully let go of her skepticism, but she could see that something in him had shifted. He wasn't just apologizing for his past anymore. He was making a choice, and she could respect that. Together, they would change the system. Together, they would build something that could actually make a difference. The road would be long, and there would be setbacks along the way. But Maya knew this was a start. It wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of something far more powerful than she had ever imagined. And for the first time, in a long while, she felt like there might be hope. The momentum of their work picked up quickly. With Maya's guidance, Thomas was diving headfirst into the trenches of social justice, his legal expertise proving invaluable as they navigated the complexities of the criminal justice system. The mentorship program was beginning to take shape, with more community leaders and activists coming on board. It was no longer just a project. It was becoming a movement. But with every step forward, the challenges became more apparent, and the realities of the fight for justice weighed heavily on Maya's shoulders. As the weeks passed, the young men who enrolled in the program began to open up more. Maya witnessed the transformation not just in their lives, but in Thomas as well. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was participating, attending support groups, meeting with families, and offering legal counsel where he could. He was starting to see the injustice in the system in ways that even Maya hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, they held a meeting with the young men, listening to their stories about their experiences in the prison system and what they needed to succeed on the outside. The conversation was raw, emotional, and sometimes hard to listen to. One man, in particular, caught Maya's attention. His name was Derek, a 25-year-old who had served 5 years for a robbery charge. He spoke about the constant surveillance, the violence, and the hopelessness of being locked up in a system that didn't care about rehabilitation, just punishment. "I did my time," Derek said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years behind bars. "But when I got out, no one cared about what I had been through. They just see a criminal. No one's ever asked me what I need to change." Maya's heart tightened as she listened to him. The anger, the pain, the desperation. It was all there in his voice. She saw Thomas watching Derek intently, his brow furrowed in thought. The judge had heard countless stories like this over the years, but hearing them now, seeing the faces behind the statistics, was different. "Derek, I know it's hard to trust the system." Thomas spoke up, his voice softer than usual. "But we're trying to change that. We're building something here that doesn't just push you back into society and expect you to fit in. We're trying to give you real tools, and I promise, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the system doesn't fail you again." Maya watched the exchange closely. She was surprised by how Thomas had phrased it, not as a judge but as an ally, a man who was beginning to understand the stakes. This wasn't just about legal reform anymore. This was about recognizing the humanity of the people they were trying to help. After the meeting, Maya found herself alone with Thomas, standing in the parking lot, the early evening sky fading into dusk. The air was cool, and the noise of the busy street outside felt distant, like it didn't belong in their world anymore. "I think Derek's right," Maya said quietly, looking at Thomas. "No one's ever asked these guys what they need. We're always telling them what they should do, but we've never listened to them." They need more than jobs and education. They need respect. They need trust. Thomas nodded, his face somber. I've spent my career as a judge, telling people what they deserve, what the law says they deserve. But I'm starting to see it differently now. This whole system, it's never been about justice. It's about control. And we're just one part of that system. The weight of his words hung between them. There was no easy fix to this. The system wasn't just broken. It was built to break people. But what they were doing here, what they were trying to build, was something different. I don't know how much I can change, Maya, Thomas said after a long pause, the honesty in his voice cutting through the tension. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fix what I've been a part of. But I want to try. I want to at least make the effort, even if it's just one person at a time. Maya turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable for a moment before she spoke. One person is enough, Thomas. If we change one person's life, if we change one system, that's how it starts. Thomas looked at her, his eyes searching for something. Understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. But Maya wasn't there to offer that. She was there to demand more. For now, it's enough, she said, her voice steady. But you've got to keep pushing. You've got to keep doing. He nodded, the resolve in his eyes matching hers. They stood in silence for a few moments, the noise of the city beginning to encroach upon their space. But Maya felt a shift, a quiet determination building between them. It was still a long road ahead, and the obstacles were still many. But for the first time, they both understood. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something you fought for, day by day, person by person, until the system finally began to bend. And Maya knew, without a doubt, they were only just getting started. As the months passed, the mentorship program began to show real results. Derek, along with several other young men who had been part of the program, was thriving. He had secured a stable job in a local auto repair shop and was actively involved in the community outreach program designed to help newly released individuals reintegrate. The transformation was striking. Derek was no longer the angry young man hardened by the prison system. He was empowered, confident, and focused on the future. Maya watched this change, her heart swelling with pride. But it was more than just Derek's success. The ripple effect of their work was starting to spread throughout the community. More families were getting involved. More young people were signing up for the program, and even some local businesses had pledged support. But while Maya was heartened by these tangible victories, she knew that the real test was still ahead. They weren't just fighting to help a few individuals. They were fighting to change an entire system. And that meant confronting the very heart of the justice system itself. One chilly morning in late fall, Maya and Thomas stood outside the courthouse. The air was brisk, and the city streets were already busy with the hustle of another day. But this was no ordinary day. Thomas was about to make a public statement, a bold one that would mark a turning point in his career and their shared mission. They had spent the last few weeks preparing, drafting statements, reaching out to advocacy groups, and gathering support from legal experts and activists alike. Thomas had agreed to testify before a committee about his experiences within the justice system and the changes that were necessary to dismantle the structural inequities that had existed for centuries. He would use his position as a judge to call for reforms in sentencing, the decriminalization of certain offenses, and increased funding for rehabilitation programs. But Maya knew this wouldn't be easy. They were about to take on the system itself, and there were forces far more powerful than them that would fight to keep things as they were. As they approached the steps of the courthouse, Thomas turned to Maya, his face a mixture of nervousness and determination. "I've never done anything like this before," he admitted, his voice tense. "I'm scared, Maya. This could end my career." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "I won't lie to you, Thomas. This will cost you. It always does when you fight for something real. But if you don't do this now, when will you? This is your moment." He nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. They entered the courthouse together, the weight of the moment heavy on both of them. Inside, the hearing was already underway. There were rows of lawmakers, lawyers, and advocates, all of them waiting to hear what Thomas had to say. When it was his turn, Thomas stood at the podium, his voice clear and steady as he spoke to the committee. He recounted his experiences as a judge, how the law had often felt more like a tool of control than a means of justice. He spoke of the countless cases he had presided over, each one shaped by systemic racism, poverty, and inequality. And he told them about the mentorship program, about the young men who had come out of prison and turned their lives around not because of the justice system, but because they had been given an opportunity to heal, to rebuild, and to thrive. Maya stood in the back of the room, watching as Thomas laid his soul bare. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a man who had seen the truth and was willing to risk everything to speak it. She felt a sense of awe and disbelief wash over her. This was the man who had fined her just months ago. This was the man who had been blind to his own privilege. And now, here he was, fighting for real change. When Thomas finished speaking, the room fell silent. There was no applause, no immediate reaction, just the weight of what had been said, hanging in the air. But Maya knew that this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over. The system wouldn't be dismantled in one speech or one testimony. But this was a start. And sometimes, the hardest part of change wasn't just recognizing that it was necessary. It was having the courage to take the first step. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Maya felt a quiet pride. They weren't done yet. There was still so much to do. But for the first time, she felt hopeful. She knew that with Thomas by her side, they had the potential to bring about something powerful, something that could last. And that, she thought, was the real victory.